Hello and welcome to today's session, which will be an introduction to public procurement. I'm Patrick Saunders. I'm an associate in the public sector team here at Ward Hadaway.
And I'm Tim Kerr, and I'm a partner in the public sector team at Ward Hadaway.
So let's just get straight into it. Can you describe what public procurement is in a nutshell?
Okay, I'll try. I'm a lawyer, so I like to use lots of words. But the procurement rules establish a framework that set out rules and procedures for the award of what are called public contracts, and they're covered if they fall within the scope of those rules and exceed certain financial thresholds, certain values, which we'll probably talk about later. And the legal framework is intended to ensure that public sector contracts are awarded in a sort of a fair, non-discriminatory way, allowing people to bid fairly for those contracts. In most cases, the public body that's procuring something is obliged to advertise that contract so that anyone can see the opportunity. And there are specific procedures for selecting the candidates and for awarding the contracts.
Okay, and I understand that our rules originated from the EU. Is that right? And can we change them?
Yes, there are kind of three parts to that answer. Mm-hmm. So pre-Brexit, obviously we were part of the EU, and our procurement law was the EU procurement law. It was set out in what were called EU directives that applied directly into UK law, and they were reflected almost word for word in our regulations. And the most commonly used form of those regulations are known as the public contract regulations, although there are others as well. And under European law, there are four main principles that govern public procurement. That's equal treatment, transparency, non-discrimination, and proportionality. And those principles apply across the whole field of public procurement. Obviously, post-Brexit, things changed a bit. But immediately after Brexit, up until roughly now, we have been required to maintain very similar rules, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, we entered into the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement when we left the EU, and as part of that, we were required to retain a very similar form of procurement law, but also because we're a member of the World Trade Organization, that requires us to follow and adopt certain procurement rules. So even since Brexit, we've had more or less the same procurement rules. However, because we left the EU, that has opened up opportunities to change our procurement law within certain parameters. So the Tory government previously, and now followed on by the Labour government, did decide to reform the UK procurement rules. And as such, they passed the Procurement Act in 2023. So we do have new rules coming into effect in 2025. But as I said before, whilst there are changes, we are still bound by sort of our international commitments. So a lot of the fundamentals of the procurement law will always be the same.
Okay. And who needs to comply with these rules?
You have to comply with them, broadly speaking, if you fall within the definition of what's called a contracting authority. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to get into too much detail about how that's defined, but broadly speaking, the sorts of authorities who are called by the rules are central government departments, strangely enough, local authorities, police and fire authorities, NHS trusts, and other sort of public bodies. Even the House of Commons is a contracting authority, if they want to procure something large enough. Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned public contracts. What is a public contract?
Well, again, there's a legal definition, and I'm not going to spend too long worrying about that. But in broad terms, it's a contract between a supplier and one of these contracting authorities. The contract has to be in writing. It has to be there has to be some form of price being paid in return for whatever's being supplied. And there are various types of public contract. So there's a contract for goods. So if you're buying equipment or paper clips or whatever, Contract for services could be consultancy services, could be facilities management services, any sort of service. Can be a contract for works, having something built for you as a contract for works, or it could be what's called a concession contract. Obvious example of a concession is like a restaurant where a public body owns the restaurant, but outsources the running of that restaurant to someone on a concession basis. So any of those types of contracts can be a public contract if they're entered into by a contracting authority, a public body.
Okay. And I'm sure people involved in procurement will have heard of thresholds. What are they?
Yes, so I mentioned earlier that contracts are caught by these rules. They are public contracts if they're above a certain value, a certain threshold. And every 2 years, the thresholds are reset. And at the moment, we're about halfway through a particular regime of thresholds. And I won't give the specific numbers because that's quite tedious, but just in round terms, if you're a central government department and you're procuring either goods or services, the threshold is about £139,000. So anything above that, you have to follow the procurement rules. If you're, say, a local authority, i.e. not a central government department, again, for goods and services, the threshold is about £214,000. If you're procuring works, doesn't matter what sort of public body you are, the threshold is about £5.3 million.
Okay.
So under that, in most circumstances, you don't have to worry about procurement rules. And if you're letting a concession, again, the value is about £5.3 million. So one of the first things you do as a procurement officer when you're procuring something is work out the estimated value, and that should instantly tell you whether or not you need to be following the procurement rules or not.
Okay, and where do you find these thresholds?
They're published by Cabinet Office every 2 years. So you can, if you just Google Cabinet Office and procurement thresholds, it will come up. We've actually got some new regulations coming into effect when the new Procurement Act takes effect, which is just going to clarify what the latest thresholds are. But they were brought into effect actually on the 1st of January 2024. So it won't be till the end of 25 that we'll get another publication from the Cabinet Office telling us what the new thresholds are.
Okay, great. Are there any types of contract which are exempt from the procurement rules?
Yes, there are. There's a list of exemptions. The main ones to bear in mind are things like acquiring land. So a basic land transaction is not caught by procurement rules. Some contracts for legal services, believe it or not, don't have to be procured under the procurement rules.
Seems like a good thing.
But it's an excellent thing. I agree with that. So loans, financial contracts, that sort of thing are exempt. And also, quite importantly, employment contracts are exempt. So that's completely outside the procurement regime. There are lots of other exempt contracts, but those are probably the most common ones. There is another type of exemption which is worth mentioning, which is in certain circumstances, one public body can award a contract direct to another public body without having to run any sort of competitive process.
Okay.
And there are a couple of main routes to go down to claim that exemption. The most well-known one is something called the TECL exemption, TECKAL, which broadly speaking would include where, say, a local authority has its own subsidiary company set up, and it might be that subsidiary company can claim that exemption and can be awarded a contract direct by the local authority because it controls that subsidiary and doesn't have to go through a competitive process.
Okay. I suspect there's a lot of people listening in who have heard of frameworks. They may even have been on frameworks. Could you just go through what these are?
Yes. Now, framework is a particular type of public contract, and it's where a contracting authority enters into a contract, often with more than one supplier, a number of suppliers, and it literally creates a framework under which that contracting authority can call off contracts over a period of time. So there might not be an actual contract awarded on day one for goods or services or works, but there'll be a call-off process during the life of the framework where those suppliers get a chance to bid for that work. So this has a number of advantages for public bodies because it means they can go through a compliant, competitive process to set the framework up. But once they've done that, they can go through a much simpler process to award the call-off contracts because they only have to deal with the suppliers who are actually appointed to that framework. So obviously there's a limited number. And from the supplier point of view, the advantage is that once you get onto a framework, you're kind of locked into it for the period of the framework, which is usually 4 years. And you don't have to reapply to get on that framework. There are some changes coming with the new Procurement Act, but we'll probably pick those up in another session. It's worth mentioning there is another type of arrangement alongside frameworks, which is currently called a dynamic purchasing system. Mm-hmm. And again, some people may have heard of dynamic purchasing systems, or DPSs, as they're known. And this is an arrangement whereby a contracting authority sets up it's similar to a framework, but it's for things that are more commonly purchased. It's more like buying off a catalogue or off the shelf, really. And it sets the dynamic purchasing system up with a fixed list of suppliers. And whenever it wants to award a contract, it only has to deal with that list. The main difference between a dynamic purchasing system and a framework is that list of suppliers is fluid. It can change. People can join it. People can drop off. So, which is completely the opposite of what I said the advantage of a framework was, in that suppliers are locked in. This is different in the suppliers. The advantage is they're not locked out of the dynamic purchasing system. Now, dynamic purchasing systems are being replaced under the new Procurement Act by something similar but not the same, called a dynamic market. Mm-hmm. And again, we'll probably pick that up in another session.
Okay. Just going back to frameworks for a moment. I'm sure you've been in this situation. I've been in this situation. I'm sure some of our listeners have, where they're told by a framework provider that no matter what the cost, once they're on it, there can be a direct award to them by a contracting authority. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, it is correct in certain circumstances.
Okay.
There are two ways that a contracting authority can award a call-off contract under a framework. One is by mini competition. So you go to the list of suppliers who you've appointed and you run it. It does what it says on the tin, a mini competition. Yeah. So they all get a chance to bid for that work. The other way of awarding a call-off contract is a direct award. So you just choose one of the suppliers and you give them the contract. Now, according to the existing procurement rules and under the new rules as well, you can only do that where all the terms of the contract are known. So you don't have to rewrite the terms of the contract. You don't have to negotiate them. You know exactly what they are. And if there's an objective mechanism for selecting the one supplier you want to award to, mm-hmm. and that is genuinely an objective mechanism. So as the contracting authority, you can't be subjective. You can't give the contract to someone just because you like them, mm-hmm. or you've dealt with them before or whatever. It has to be objective. And an example of an objective mechanism would be if you rank all the suppliers on your framework in the order in which they scored when they bid to get on the framework. So, the highest score goes top, yeah. And then you go down the scale. And you always award to the highest scorer, say. That's objective. Okay. Or you use what's called the cab rank rule. So you award the first contract the highest scorer, and then your second contract goes to the second highest scorer. I personally don't particularly like that method, but it's objective and it meets the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, thanks for clarifying that. That's really helpful. So far, this all does seem quite simple. If a contracting authority cannot take advantage of an exemption from the procurement rules and the contract it wants to procure is above threshold, what does it have to do?
Right. Well, obviously, there's a lot of things in the procurement rules that the contracting authority has to follow. So, first of all, in broad terms, there has to be an advertisement. So, in the old days, pre-Brexit, you published an advertisement in what was called the Official Journal of the European Union, which is why you used to call them OJEU notices.
Yeah.
Now you have to publish an advertisement on what's called the UK e-notification service, to give it a grand title, which is called Find a Tender. And you publish a notice on there. And now anyone in the world can log into that and see that notice and see that opportunity, that advertisement. But that's usually how it starts. And so that means that that opportunity is visible to anyone who accesses that site. Then, having done that advertisement, the authority has to follow a compliant process in accordance with the rules. And there are a number of different procurement processes, which I won't spend time talking about because they're going to disappear when the new Procurement Act comes into effect. But there are particular rules about different types of process and how they can progress and what the contracting authority can and can't do. But having received the tender, the contracting authority then has to apply certain rules to select the winning tenderer, which is usually called the most economically advantageous tender. At least it is called that until the new Procurement Act, when it's going to change very slightly. And there are rules about how it selects that winning bidder, and then also how it notifies people whether they've won or lost. So there's a series of rules that deal with the sort of the life cycle of the procurement process that it has to follow.
Okay. I'm sure people are aware that contracts can be divided into lots. What does that mean?
Yes. Well, yes. Let's try and think of an example. So an example might be if an authority wants to outsource all of its facilities management of its, let's say it's a local authority, that's the town hall, wants to outsource all the facilities management. Now, facilities management is a very broad term, and it can include all your maintenance and life cycle repairs and replacement, all the equipment in the building, all the cleaning, the catering, maybe the post room services, maybe the telephony system, all sorts of things. So it might be that whilst you have a need for facilities management, you can divide that up into its specific elements or lots. And so when you go out to tender, you can divide it up into lots, which means that potentially bidders can bid for just one or two or however many of those lots they can actually deal with. So the advantage from the bidder's point of view is you might not be excluded from a big contract if it's divided into lots, because there might be a smaller element you can bid for. And the advantage from the contracting authority's point of view is you'll get bids from the experts for each of those components, rather than one global organisation which says it can do everything but isn't necessarily expert in all of them. I mean, that's a bit of a sweeping statement, but that's the way it goes. There is actually a requirement in the procurement rules, and this will continue under the new Act, for the authority to consider breaking up contracts into lots. And that's part of government policy to try and encourage small and medium-sized enterprises to bid for and to be awarded public contracts, because obviously the lots will package things up into smaller elements.
Okay. You've mentioned that there's often some sort of pre-selection or shortlisting which suppliers have to go through if they want to bid for a contract. Is that a really onerous task for them?
Can I be a typical lawyer and say yes and no?
If you must.
I'm afraid it's what I do for a living, so I'm going to have to do that. There's always a certain amount of information that a bidder has to give to the contracting authority in a bidding process. And there is a requirement on a contracting authority to exclude some bidders if they trigger various kind of red flags, like, for instance, if they've been guilty of a tax crime or something like that. So the authority will always ask for information from every bidder at the start of the process. It's also entitled to ask for information about their financial standing, economic and financial standing, their technical ability. So it's, it makes common sense that you can ask bidders, whether they can actually do the thing you're asking them to do, whether they've got experience. So there's often this kind of pre-selection process where you weed out the people who should either be excluded or who actually can't do the job. So that has in the past been recognised as an onerous thing for smaller businesses to do. Every time they bid for a contract, they have to answer these questions and give this information. There have been attempts in the past to simplify that, but it's always been criticised as a bit of a hurdle in the way of smaller businesses. The new Procurement Act is attempting to simplify that, so it'll be good to see if that actually happens. Certainly SMEs are just not really resourced to spend the time and the effort in responding to those sorts of queries. So any effort to simplify it, I think, is gladly received, particularly in the SME sector.
Okay. So taking all of that into account, what happens if a supplier doesn't win a tender but feels that they should have done, or the contracting authority did something wrong?
Yeah.
What can they do?
Well, we're here talking about whether you can challenge the results of a tender, and the answer is yes. You can. This is a very big subject in its own right, but there are processes and there are potential remedies available to a losing bidder, depending on what's happened and why they've lost. So, as a very general principle, every contracting authority has to comply with the rules. And if they breach those rules at any stage in the process, theoretically, an aggrieved bidder has the opportunity to challenge and seek redress in the courts. The starting point is often, but not always, but is often when the authority has selected its winner and it notifies all the bidders of the result. And it'll tell the losers in particular what they scored and why they scored what they scored, but it will also tell them what the winning bidder scored and why the winning bidder got their scores. So that's all laid out in front of a losing bidder, and they get a chance to look at that and think, well, hang on a second, there's something not right here. And if they feel they've got grounds, they can bring a challenge. There's also what's called a standstill period. So once the award has been notified, i.e. The contracting authority has told everyone that there's a winner and who the winner is, there's usually a standstill period, and all bidders have got that standstill period to decide whether or not they want to take action. The rules relating to the standstill period are slightly changing under the Procurement Act, but only slightly, really. There's also an overlap between what's called the standstill period, which at the moment is only 10 days, and it's going to change to 8 working days. So not much of a change, but an important one. There's an overlap between that and what's called the limitation period, which is a more general sort of legal concept. But the limitation period in most circumstances is still only 30 days. So bidders have got a very short time in which to decide whether they want to take action. But if they do challenge, there are various remedies that are available to them. So for a start, in some circumstances, if they do challenge, then the contracting authority will be automatically suspended from being able to actually award the contract that it's been procuring. So it goes into a sort of a limbo. So that protects the aggrieved bidder in some ways. And then, the authority can apply to court to get that suspension lifted, and that often actually happens. But it's quite a big thing, that suspension. And then the sort of remedies that a losing bidder can get beyond that are, it could be that the court could award the contract to them rather than the person who we all thought had won. That doesn't happen very often, but it's something the court can do. Or the court could make an order, for instance, that the procurement process gets wound back to an earlier stage in order to put right a problem that happened during the procurement. or it can order that procurement is abandoned and started again. Or it could award damages to the losing bidder and say, well, we're not going to interfere with the award of the contract, but we're going to award you damages for the loss of opportunity and the loss of the contract that you might have won. So there's a range of different remedies that are available. It's quite difficult for a lot of bidders to get that far because they've got to act very, very quickly. And almost by definition, they're doing so without much information.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult call for them to make. But nevertheless, those remedies are real, and we see a lot of challenges happening.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Tim. That's been really useful. We look forward to seeing everybody else in later sessions.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick.